digital clock on the dashboard read 3:14 a.m. At that hour, the city didn't just feel asleep, it felt dead. A carcass of concrete and damp asphalt swallowed by a fog so dense it reduced the world to the frail reach of his low beams. Inside the car, the cloying scent of a cheap vanilla air freshener fought against the bitter odor of stale coffee and Arthur's own cold sweat. His eyes, bloodshot and heavy from chronic sleep deprivation, stared blankly at the empty road ahead. The exhaustion was no longer just physical. It had become a persistent mental fog that blurred the edges of his perception, making the shadows of the passing lampposts look like elongated, twitching arms reaching out for the vehicle. Arthur drove out of sheer necessity, or perhaps as a form of self-punishment. Every mile driven was a desperate attempt to drown out the voices in his head. Voices that constantly reminded him of his financial ruin and the marriage that had collapsed under the weight of his poor choices. He was drowning in debt, and the cabin of the gray sedan had effectively become his solitary confinement cell. The heavy silence of the night was his only companion, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the engine and the wet slap of the tires against the cracked pavement. Then the phone mounted on the dashboard shattered the stillness. The sharp, high-pitched ping of the rideshare app echoed through the confined space like a gunshot. Arthur blinked hard, trying to clear his vision. The violent blue glow of the screen illuminated his haggard face, casting deep, hollow shadows under his eyes. He looked at the digital map. The pickup point was less than a mile away, in a desolate, forgotten peripheral district that most drivers actively avoided after midnight. The final destination wasn't even listed, only a gray, endless line that seemed to fade into the digital void of the interface. Despite the uneasy chill that crawled up his spine, his desperate financial situation spoke louder than his intuition. He tapped the screen. Ride accepted. As he drove closer to the destination, the flickering streetlights of the city began to thin out, replaced by a massive, oppressive darkness. The paved road gave way to uneven dirt and gravel, causing the car to vibrate violently. The GPS guided him deeper into a forgotten rural stretch, where the overgrown, twisted trees seemed to arch over the roof of the car, clawing at the sky. The sense of isolation became suffocating. There were no other headlights, no houses, no signs of human life. Just the mechanical drone of his engine and the heavy, uneven thumping of his own heart. "You have arrived at your destination," the synthesized, emotionless voice of the navigation app announced. Arthur brought the car to a slow halt. The headlights cut through the swirling mist, revealing the crumbling stone facade of an old, abandoned cemetery. Wrought iron gates, warped and choked with rust, hung precariously from cracked stone pillars. Beyond the threshold, gray tombstones and partially collapsed mausoleums rose from the earth like rotten teeth in an open mouth. The air outside looked thick, exhaling the smell of wet earth, mold, and decaying vegetation. He glanced down at his phone. The green dot representing the passenger was pulsing slowly, right in the center of the cemetery grounds, where the graves were most densely packed. "There's nobody here," Arthur whispered to himself, his voice sounding strange, fragile, and small within the quiet cab. He reached his hand out toward the phone, intending to cancel the ride and get out of there. Common sense was screaming at him to throw the car into reverse and flee back to the brightly lit avenues of the city. But before his fingertip could touch the glass, the app's status abruptly shifted on its own. Passenger on board. The click was subtle, but unmistakable. The sound of the rear door opening and softly latching shut echoed right behind Arthur's head. The air temperature inside the vehicle plummeted instantly. The artificial smell of vanilla vanished, replaced by a freezing draft that carried the heavy scent of deep, overturned earth and an old, cloying floral perfume, like lilies left to rot inside a sealed coffin. Arthur's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. He couldn't see anything through the dense, heavy shadow occupying the back seat. The distant fog outside blocked what little moonlight there was, leaving the rear passenger side in total darkness. And yet, the weight was undeniably there. He felt the car's suspension tilt slightly to the right. He felt an invisible, heavy pressure in the air that seemed to actively suck the oxygen right out of his lungs. His throat went completely dry. He tried to speak, to ask for the passenger's name to confirm the security protocol of the app, but the words trapped themselves in his chest. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. "Sir, ma'am," Arthur choked out, his eyes still glued to the mirror, desperately trying to discern a silhouette, a face, a limb, anything in the dark. No voice answered him. Instead, a soft, wet, rhythmic sound began. It sounded like someone breathing, slow, shallow, and ragged right behind his neck. With every exhale, the air in the car grew noticeably colder, and a thin layer of frost began to web across the edges of the side windows. Arthur looked back down at his phone, his hand trembling so violently he could barely hold it steady. The map on the screen had completely changed. The standard street lines were gone, replaced by a single jagged red route that led directly backward, deeper into the dark heart of the cemetery, past the rusted iron gates that he could swear had been locked tight just seconds ago. He looked through the windshield. The gates were now wide open, yawning into the blackness. Paranoia gripped his chest like a vice. His mind began to fracture under the sheer impossibility of the situation. Was he hallucinating? Was this a cruel prank? Or had the sleepless nights finally broken his brain? He wanted to scream, to jump out of the moving car, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if the presence in the back seat was anchoring him to the driver's seat. The phone vibrated violently in his hand. A text message from the passenger popped up on the screen, overriding the map. The message simply read, "Drive." Arthur didn't remember putting his foot on the accelerator, but the car began to move. The tires crunched against the wet gravel, rolling past the rusted iron gates and into the suffocating darkness of the cemetery grounds. The headlights flickered violently, their beams cutting weak, trembling lines through the fog. On either side of the narrow dirt path, old stone angels with broken wings and weathered tombstones seemed to lean forward, watching the vehicle pass like silent, judgmental spectators. The cold inside the cabin was no longer just a physical sensation. It felt active, biting into Arthur's skin and settling deep within his bones. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead, terrified of what he might see if he looked at the rearview mirror again. Yet the psychological weight in the back seat was expanding. The shallow, wet breathing behind him grew slightly faster, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic scratching sound, like fingernails dragging slowly across the fabric of the rear seat. He tried to look at the GPS for a way out, but the digital screen was glitched. The map spun in erratic circles, and the ETA counter began ticking backward, showing negative numbers that changed rapidly. Where are we going?" Arthur stammered, his voice cracking. He hated how pathetic he sounded. He hated the way his own breath came out in thick white plumes inside the car. No verbal answer came. Instead, the phone vibrated again. Another text message from the rider account blurred onto the screen. "You know the way. You've been running from this destination for years." The words hit Arthur like a physical blow. A suffocating wave of guilt, heavy and familiar, washed over him. His mind flashed to the worst moments of his past. The deceit, the hidden debts, the night he packed his bags and left his family in the dark, choosing cowardice over confrontation. The presence in the back didn't just feel like a random passenger anymore. It felt intimately connected to his worst secrets. It felt like a manifestation of his own rotting conscience. Suddenly, the headlights caught something in the middle of the path. Arthur slammed on the brakes. The car skidded on the mud, coming to a harsh stop just inches away from a figure standing in the fog. Arthur's heart leaped into his throat. It was a woman, her back turned to the car. She wore a stained, outdated dress, and her hair was matted with dark, wet earth. But what made Arthur's blood run completely cold was her posture. Her shoulders were hunched in a way that looked deeply, structurally wrong, as if her spine had been shattered and reassembled incorrectly. Before he could process the horror in front of him, the wet breathing right behind his ear stopped. Arthur slowly, agonizingly turned his head a fraction of an inch to the right. In the faint green glow of the dashboard, he saw a pale, bloated hand reach forward from the darkness of the back seat. The fingers were long, the skin translucent and slick with grave dirt, ending in torn, blackened nails. The hand didn't touch him. It simply pointed a single finger directly at the windshield toward the woman standing in the road. At that exact moment, the woman in front of the car began to turn around. She didn't turn her body, she turned her head. A full, sickening 180-degree twist. Through the mud-splattered windshield, Arthur looked into her face. It was hollow, the eyes replaced by empty, weeping black sockets, but the twisted, mocking smile on her lips belonged to someone he knew. It was a distorted, monstrous version of his ex-wife. No, this isn't real. I'm asleep, I'm just exhausted," Arthur screamed, slamming his palms against the steering wheel. He closed his eyes tight, counting to 3, praying to open them and find himself parked at a gas station, asleep over the wheel. When he opened his eyes, the figure in front of the car was gone. But the scratching sound didn't come from the back seat anymore. It came from under his seat. Something small, cold, and frantic was tapping against the floorboards beneath his feet, right under the pedals, trying to claw its way up through the metal of the car. The phone on the dashboard began to chime rapidly, receiving dozens of notifications a second. Ride canceled. Ride updated. Fare increased. Passenger is waiting. Passenger is behind you. Passenger is you. The text shifted into bizarre, unreadable symbols, melting down the screen like black ink. The isolation was now absolute. The world outside the windows had dissolved into a thick, featureless void of black fog. There was no road left. There was only the car, the freezing cold, and the terrifying certainty that his identity was being stripped away, piece by piece, by the thing riding with him in the dark. The car was no longer moving forward. It felt as though it were sinking. The engine gasped and sputtered, emitting a low, dying rattle that vibrated through Arthur's seat. Yet the speedometer on the dashboard violently jumped to its absolute limit, the needle trembling against the peg. Outside, the black fog pressed hard against the glass, flattening itself like a physical, suffocating weight. The windows began to crack under an immense, unseen atmospheric pressure. Webbed lines of fractured glass spiderwebbing across Arthur's vision. The tapping beneath his feet abruptly stopped. In the sudden, agonizing silence, the temperature inside the cabin dropped so low that Arthur's skin began to sting. His own fingers gripping the steering wheel were stiff, turning a brittle, ghostly shade of blue. Then the car's internal lights turned on. The harsh yellow dome light exposed the interior with violent clarity. Arthur's eyes were wide, bloodshot, and dilated with raw terror. He slowly raised his gaze to the rearview mirror, unable to fight the morbid compulsion any longer. The back seat was no longer empty. Sitting directly behind him was a mass of shifting, wet shadows that didn't seem to obey the laws of geometry. It had no definitive shape, yet it possessed a grotesque, undulating mass that smelled intensely of iron, old copper, and decayed flesh. Out of the center of this darkness, dozens of human eyes blinked in unison, unblinking, wet, and ancient. They weren't strangers' eyes. Arthur recognized them. He saw the weeping eyes of his mother, the hollow glare of his old creditors, the disappointed stare of his daughter. Every eye he had ever run away from was staring back at him through the glass. A voice tore through the silence. It didn't come from the space behind him, it vibrated directly inside Arthur's skull, a discordant chorus of whispers that sounded like wet leaves scraping against a window pane. Every ride has a cost, Arthur. You thought you were driving to escape the wreckage you left behind, but you were just delivering yourself to us. Arthur tried to scream, but his jaw locked. A sudden, violent convulsion racked his body. His hands were forced away from the steering wheel by an invisible, crushing gravity. He watched in horror as his own reflection in the rearview mirror began to act independently. The reflection of Arthur in the glass wasn't panicked. It was smiling. A wide, jagged, impossible grin that stretched from ear to ear, splitting the skin of his cheeks until dark, thick blood began to ooze down his chin. The phone on the dashboard began to melt. The plastic casing bubbled and hissed, dripping onto the console like liquid tar, but the screen remained glowing, emitting a blinding crimson light. The synthesized voice of the app spoke one last time, no longer human, but layered with a deep, cosmic resonance. Destination reached. The end of you. The windshield shattered. But instead of glass flying inward, the darkness from the outside poured into the car like tidal wave of black water. The smell of cold earth rushed into Arthur's lungs, choking him, blinding him. He felt himself being pulled backward, not by physical hands, but by the sheer gravitational pull of the entity in the back seat. His body was sinking into the upholstery, his limbs dissolving into the fabric of the car, becoming part of the machine, part of the landscape of graves. He realized then, with a devastating surge of existential dread, that he hadn't picked up a passenger tonight. The app hadn't made a mistake. The cemetery wasn't a random location. He had died miles ago, an exhausted man falling asleep at the wheel on a lonely highway. And this car was his eternal claustrophobic hell, a loop of guilt and terror from which there was no escape. The entity's eyes opened wider, filling his entire field of vision, swallowing his consciousness into a void where time and identity ceased to exist. The static was the first thing to return. It wasn't the sound of the engine nor the wet breathing, but a dry, crackling white noise that seemed to scrape against the inside of Arthur's skull. Slowly, the world reassembled itself around him. The blinding crimson light and the shifting mass of eyes were gone. Arthur blinked, his vision blurry and stinging from the harsh, clinical light overhead. He wasn't in the car. He was sitting on a cold metal bench inside a dimly lit gas station convenience store on the edge of the highway. In front of him sat a half-empty cup of lukewarm, bitter coffee. His body trembled violently as he gasped for air, clutching his chest. His heart was hammering like a trapped bird against his ribs. He looked down at his hands. They were no longer blue, but they were pale. And his knuckles were raw and bleeding, as if he had been gripping something with impossible, inhuman force. Just a dream. A micro-nap, he whispered, his voice a ragged sob of pure relief. I fell asleep. The exhaustion, it made me hallucinate. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and stood up on shaky legs. The clerk behind the counter didn't even look up from his small television screen, which was displaying nothing but gray, flickering static. Arthur walked out of the store, the cool night air hitting his face. The relief was intoxicating, a sweet surge of adrenaline that told him he was alive. He was sane. He was safe. His gray sedan was parked right outside, under the flickering halogen light of the gas pump. Arthur walked over to the driver's side, eager to drive home, to sleep for days, to fix his life, to call his ex-wife, to do anything but ever drive the graveyard shift again. He opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. The familiar smell of cheap vanilla air freshener greeted him. He laughed, a breathless, hysterical sound. It had all been a nightmare. Then he looked at his dashboard. The phone was there, securely mounted on its plastic bracket. It wasn't melted. The screen was perfectly intact, displaying the standard, familiar interface of the rideshare app. But as Arthur reached out to turn it off, he froze. The app was currently in the middle of an active ride. The digital map didn't show the highway he was on. It showed a bird's-eye view of a vast, sprawling grid of black squares, a perfect digital blueprint of the abandoned cemetery. The green arrow representing his car was parked directly in the center of it, surrounded by thousands of tiny gray tombstone icons. Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. The illusion of safety shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He looked at the fare counter at the top of the screen. The numbers weren't displaying currency. They were rapidly ticking upward in years, decades, centuries. A soft, familiar click echoed from behind him. The sound of the rear passenger door latching shut. Arthur's neck went rigid. The warmth of the gas station vanished, sucked out of the cabin in an instant. The scent of vanilla was violently choked out by the sudden, overwhelming stench of wet, overturned earth and decaying lilies. He didn't turn around. He didn't look at the rearview mirror. He couldn't, because in the reflection of the driver's side window, projected against the darkness outside, he could see his own face. His eyes were wide with a terror that would never leave them, but his mouth, independent of his will, was stretching. The corners of his lips pulled backward, splitting the skin, widening into that same jagged, impossible bleeding grin. The phone vibrated in his hand. A single text message from the rider account illuminated the dark cabin. "Did you really think you could leave the vehicle?" Arthur's hand slowly, mechanically moved toward the gear shift. His body was no longer his own. It was a puppet being operated by the heavy, silent weight occupying his back seat. He threw the car into drive. As the sedan rolled forward, the lights of the gas station behind him didn't fade into the distance. They simply vanished, swallowed by a thick, featureless fog that had no beginning and no end. The scars weren't physical. They were woven into the fabric of his eternity. He was doomed to keep driving, a prisoner of his own unresolved guilt, picking up the pieces of his broken past over and over again, for a passenger that would never let him go. The screen fades to absolute black, but the audio doesn't stop. For several agonizing seconds, there is only the sound of a turn signal clicking in the dark. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It is a rhythmic, hypnotic sound, heavy with the realization that the journey is endless. Then slowly, the faint blue glow of a smartphone screen illuminates the darkness one last time. It is not Arthur's phone anymore. The interface looks exactly like the one on your own device. The camera slowly pans back, revealing a vacant driver's seat. The car is moving, steering itself through a thick, eternal mist, but the back seat is obscured by a shadow so dense it seems to bleed out of the edges of the frame. The wet, shallow breathing from the opening chapter returns, but this time it is layered, sounding closer, as if it is coming from right behind your headphones. A final text notification pops up on the screen, accompanied by that sharp, high-pitched ping. The text reads, "Looking for a ride?" The static returns, louder this time, a harsh frequency that vibrates until the audio abruptly cuts out, leaving only a cold, dead silence. Thank you for surviving this journey into the deepest corners of the mind. This story wasn't just about a driver lost in the dark. It was about the heavy, unresolved baggage we all carry in our own back seats. The things we refuse to look at in the mirror don't disappear. They just wait for the right moment to claim their fare. If this nightmare crawled under your skin, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like to keep the shadows fed. But before you close this tab and return to your reality, I have one question for you to leave in the comments below. What is the one secret, the one piece of guilt you are running from right now? And are you absolutely sure that the sound you just heard in your house was just the wind? Watch your mirrors, and never accept a ride after midnight.